Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today's Monday, June 3rd, 2019, and I'm Cara Santa Maria. And this week we have a fascinating episode for you. But before we dive in, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I rely on support from people just like you. My Patreon, not looking so hot lately. I think it might be a tough time for some people, and I totally respect that, and I totally understand that. If you are already on Patreon and you're looking to diversify your support, if this is the time when you're thinking, hey, maybe I want to help out with the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can read all about how you can pledge your support. Of course, if it's not the right time or if it's just not something you want to do, all good. All good. I still love you, and I'm glad that you're here listening to the show. But this week, I do want to thank Patreon, the top supporters on Patreon. They include Phil T. Bear, the Zombie Drummer, David J.E. Smith, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. Thank you guys so very much. All right, let's get into the show, shall we? Today, we get to talk to Dr. Erin Clabough. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Yes, Clabough, she says. Or maybe it's Clabough. Dang it. I think it's Clabough. She is a mother of 4. She also has her PhD in neuroscience. Right now, she teaches biology and neuroscience at Hampton-Sydney College, and she does research on developmental brain functioning. But she wrote a book recently called Second Nature: How Parents Can Use Neuroscience to Help Kids Develop Empathy, Creativity, and Self-Control. So freaking important. So honored that she was able to join me to chat all about it. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Erin Clabough. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Cara.
So I am sitting in a hotel room in New York City right now. Where are you calling in from?
I am at my home in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Nice. Okay, so we're on the same coast.
Yeah.
That's good. Usually I'm on West Coast time. And for some reason, I feel like I'm always connecting to people. It's like super early in the morning to me. And they're like, yeah, it's not morning, crazy lady. So this is nice. It's 1 p.m. for both of us on a Monday as we're recording this. And I have to say, I'm really thrilled that you accepted my invitation to chat today. We're going to focus a little bit on your new book, Second Nature: How Parents Can Use Neuroscience to Help Kids Develop Empathy, Creativity, and Self-Control. I love the topic of your book. I think it's so important. Oh my gosh, it's so important. So before we get into why it's so important, let's talk a little bit about why you decided to write this book. You yourself are a neuroscientist, aren't you?
I am a neuroscientist by training. And then along the way, I had 4 kids. So I think that the reason that I ended up writing the book is because the book that I wanted wasn't there. I mean, I've heard people say that before, but in this case, I felt like it was kind of true that I was looking up things about how to parent in the primary literature because I couldn't find a parenting book that wasn't really baby-centered, such that you were tiptoeing around your baby all the time, or really parent-centered, such that you were kind of putting your child on the schedule that you dictated. There's not a lot. At the time when I was raising my first couple, that was right in the middle. And that was really evidence-based, which was important to me as a neuroscientist.
Yeah. And so does this have crossover with the work you do in your professional career? Like, are you studying child development? Are you studying parent-infant connections? Or is this like a huge departure, but it was really informed by motherhood?
Well, I'm a basic neuroscientist, as my training is in molecular genetics and in how neurons connect together, like on a really cellular or even like molecular way. And so this is definitely an extrapolation, but one of the things that I think I was kind of compelled to write it because I realized that parents don't have basic information about how neurons connect together. And one of the reasons is because it's kind of hard to get past all the jargon and to see what's important and what's not important. And when you read a paper and it's got 80 acronyms in it with, scientists think they're funny and like to name proteins like sonic hedgehog and these things. And it's hard to kind of see what the reality is and how on earth you could ever apply any kind of basic neuroscientist principle to raising a kid, because you're tired and you don't have the fortitude to do that. I mean, you can barely pick up like the pacifier off the floor, much less go into PubMed late at night and figure out if it really is true that you can't let your kid watch 20 minutes of Baby Einstein while you're making dinner.
It's so true. I mean, I see this a lot with, less so with this podcast, with Talk Nerdy, although I do get emails and questions a lot, but also with the other work that I do with the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which is a science and skepticism podcast that's very informed by evidence-based medicine, that people are always asking about skeptical or evidence-based parenting because they're like, I don't even know where to start. There's so much woo, and there's so much just like people out there giving advice based on anecdote.
Well, and you can also, sometimes you can back up conflicting advice with different studies that how do you know how to judge, especially if both look valid? It's just hard to know, period. And pseudoscience is, I think, the worst when it comes to matters of the brain. If you just put an image of a brain on something, it'll sell better. And so this bleed over of marketing into daily kind of propaganda for parents is so dangerous to the way that we raise our kids and also the way that we feel about the way that we're raising our kids.
It's so true. Don't you just feel like all you have to do in order to write a compelling news article about basically anything is use the word neuroplasticity in it? And people are like, ooh, neuroplasticity. And you're like, yeah. Or I could just say learning. Like, I think it's so like overused. And you're right. You can put these like real buzzwords into something and people will put it on this real pedestal. And so they're hungry to hear from legitimate scientists what they've learned in doing their own real research or even just their own review of the literature. That, I must mention, because I think I've said this before on the show, there was a recent study that we covered on the SGU that showed that research articles, peer-reviewed journal articles, are becoming less readable. They're harder to understand as the years go on.
That's what I'm talking about with the jargon. I completely understand that. And it's a shame too, because I do feel like parents really want to do the right thing by their kids and they are hungry for this kind of information. And at the same time, you've got scientists who are becoming more and more like in their own little specific pathway in their specific molecule, and they're becoming experts on this one little tiny thing. And they almost never get a chance to come back out and make it global and make it applicable to all those people out there who are hungry for the information. These translator people, they don't exist very much.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, science communication is really still a burgeoning field. People like myself, people like a lot of my colleagues are doing it, but sometimes we don't specialize as much as we probably could. Like I'm much more of a general science communicator. And so I'm always excited when I have people on the show, for example, to talk about things like parenthood, because I do think it's one of these areas that is like the wild, wild west for so many people who are just looking for good, reliable information.
It is. And so my basic research that I do in the lab now, I have a developmental lab where I look at synaptic plasticity and just the changes that happen on this synapse level. And I look kind of at what goes wrong. So I use a fetal alcohol model in the lab and do animal research, but I also do research with kids too, because it occurred to me as I'm looking at what goes wrong in early development when you interfere with typical developmental processes, that can you then kind of go the other direction? And how can you use these like kind of pathways and manipulate them in a way that is actually for the benefit or to make them stronger? And so this idea of practice, and that all practice is really strengthening that connection between neurons. Then parents, if they figure out how actually learning works, like on a basic level between two neurons and how you can strengthen that, then the parent can pick what they want to focus on with their child. And so these basic nuts and bolts, the parents don't get. And because of that, then we get really at a disadvantage as parents because we don't know who to listen to in terms of which is the most important, right? So we're missing the like middle tier and we kind of get fed the end result, but we don't have the basic resources to be able to judge for ourselves what to kind of put our efforts into when we're raising our kids or not. So things like creativity and empathy and self-control, like the three things that I focused on in this book, you could, as a parent, focus on any three traits that you felt like you wanted your kid to have. That could be math and piano and, I don't know, Japanese or whatever you thought was important. The same functional structure applies to how those connections are made and what a parent can do to foster them.
You know, I have to say, though, I really appreciate the sort of core focus that you decided to curate in your book, which are these three pillars, I guess you could say, empathy, creativity, and self-control, because it really does flip the script towards something that, you know, I used to work in neuroscience and now I work in psychology, and in seeing actually adolescent patients, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is this transition into more like strength-based psychotherapy. And I feel like that's really embodied in your book. It's not just about how not to like mess up our kids. It's really about how do we cultivate and curate or nurture, I should say, these skills or these traits or whatever you want to call them that will really fundamentally improve their lives.
Yeah, I had thought really long and hard about this. And honestly, my perspective on the things that I thought were important really changed when my first son hit kindergarten or first grade. Because what I realized is that if I didn't teach those three things at home, this child was not going to get those things. And I think I had thought that I was kind of doing I was balanced. I was teaching these things at home before he went to school. I was also teaching, the letters and teaching music and things like that. And I think I kind of naively thought that he would kind of get all that stuff at school.
Yeah, just kind of passively by existing in the world or like from the teachers, right? Because we think that school is, like school is where you learn stuff, but it's also where you learn interpersonal skills. And I don't know, I think that we do have an idea, at least in American society, where like we have public education and like it's kind of a rite of passage. Kids legally have to go, that like they learn a lot of these fundamental skills there, but they probably don't, do they?
Well, they learn a lot of what not to do.
Yeah, that's true. They learn about like societal rules.
Yeah, and that's okay. And for certain kinds of kids, I think that would also not stunt their overall development because they would kind of respond to that. But in particular, my oldest son was someone who wanted to act all the time, and so being told no, 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 he needed to rechannel. And so he learned the rules very quickly, but then didn't have avenues to make a difference or to take control of his own learning or to take control of the social situations. And it was kind of frustrating for me because I was like, okay, well, how can I do that? And he has siblings, so I can do that kind of stuff at home. But one of my really good friends has a only child, and I'm his godmother. And so we kind of did all this together. And it's harder to teach an only child how to do social interactions. I mean, you're going to be that mom on the playground who's like getting in other people's sand fight businesses. A lot of it can be done in role play and kind of in absence. What should you have done? What could you do next time? But I mean, parents kind of got to get in there. At the same time, we're having this whole societal debate over this free range versus helicopter, and neither one is ideal.
Yeah. We tend to go to extremes, don't we? We tend to think in really, really binary manner that like something has to be this or that. When it's like, no, there can be some ambivalence, there can be some nuance. Usually that's probably more ideal.
Yeah. Well, I think that's easier to, especially when the content's hard, like neuroscience is hard, to understand, be this way or be that way. But when it comes to child development, the best way, in my opinion, to do it is to be kind of helicopter at first. And as soon as they're able to do it themselves, you're out. Right. And it's this kind of tiered process where the end goal is to absolutely be free range. And it just depends on your kid. And you're going to go, in certain realms, you're going to be kind of still helicopter. And in other realms, you're going to be super hands off and have been able to be that way from day one.
So I've got to know, because so much of what you're talking about in your book is like practical knowledge, right? Like this is about parenting, which is in some ways really subjective, in some ways really culture bound. It's incredibly contextual, depending on where you live and the type of family that you have, your religion, your societal influences, your traditions, your family, all that good stuff. It's very psychology. And you are coming from this very kind of basic neuroscience place. What was the experience like for you doing all the research that you needed to do to be able to write this book and making those translations for the reader?
Well, I was a psychology major as an undergrad.
Nice.
And then I did 1 year of a developmental cognitive neuroscience program before I realized that the questions that I kept asking were, okay, this is how the brain works, but what happens beneath that? And then when they say, well, it's a brain region, I'll say, okay, let's look at that. What happens beneath that? Oh, that's a pathway. Okay, what happens beneath that? A cell. What happens beneath that? A protein. Like I keep going lower and lower because I'm just so interested in what's next. And so kind of writing this book a little bit was me kind of going full circle to how I first got interested in psychology to begin with. I did stress research in college. And when I was in my developmental neuroscience program, I did a lot of work with human subjects with autism and with Down syndrome and some schizophrenic work. And so I felt like it was nice to be able to go back into that literature after spending so long in the literature that's kind of full of all that jargon and hard to understand.
Yeah. And really in this kind of place that's very specific and drilled down and like with a high resolution. When we're existing in the cellular sphere or even the molecular sphere, these are fundamental things, but the gestalt can sometimes be missing a little bit, right? But also there's this difficulty and frustration that comes from psychology research and psychology literature, which is that it's just not as clean as biology literature.
Yeah,
it's really not.
I agree. I'm trying to bridge both worlds because I feel like we understand psychology studies a lot better. Like you can actually pick up a study and read that.
Yeah, it's true. They kind of speak to it because, of course, they're about people. And that makes more sense to us as consumers of information.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so I think my impulse with the book was to say, okay, if we teach this one idea of there's a first neuron and a second neuron and what happens when they are repeatedly sending a signal from one to another, say 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. How long do those effects last? They last a really long time. They can last a year later, that response after just being stimulated 1 time. A year later, that second response is going to be stronger. Like parents know they don't have to be on and practicing these things all the time, that intermittent practice, when you have 3 minutes of some kind of creative exercise or some kind of perspective taking for building empathy, that you can do that and you don't have to do it the way you practice the piano 30 minutes a day.
Yeah.
We don't need our kids to be perfect at these things. We need them to be proficient. And what I was realizing as my kids were growing up is that people are not proficient at these things anymore. They're not competent at them. And it's so important that they are, just for life, like worldview and problem solving and being in charge of your own decisions, finding other avenues to get where you want to go when you get a no, being able to hear a no and not argue with someone that the no is not really a no. These things are really important just to be a nice person.
I hate to get political, and maybe I won't really completely go there, but there is just so much to unpack with what you're saying about these core kind of traits. that we are not, I think, that aren't well represented right now in the political landscape. And it's difficult, right? When kids really do absorb and model what's around them. They don't really have their own identity develops over several years. And so much of what we are as young people is just what we know. It's the reason that kids who grow up in abusive relationships or with abusive parents don't even realize that that's abnormal.
Right.
Until they're shown that not every other kid lives that way. And so, living in a society or a culture where whatever your politics are, things like empathy, creativity, and self-control, being able to understand the difference between, a yes and a no, understanding consent, understanding that it's okay to be wrong, and that when you are wrong, that's a growth experience. I worry that kids aren't getting that from the media or even necessarily in the classroom.
Oh, they're definitely not getting it from the media. I mean, I find my main role with the media these days with my kids is that of almost like fact checker. Almost, I'm like, Do you believe that, what you just heard? What do you think about that? These questions. I mean, it happens even before the last 3 or 4 years of politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
we had these things with like the the autism link with the vaccine, that study. And my son just the other day he's doing this virtual health online class for school that he is just dying, listening to this person talk about vaccines and the anti-vaccine movement. And he looked and he's like, why on earth would anyone not vaccinate their children? And I'm like,
love it.
Like, okay, let's just talk about, and he knows, he's like, oh gosh, here we go. I'm like, number one, there used to be thimerosal as a preservative, which is mercury based in the vaccine. So you want single use. And then also there was this doctor in the UK, 15 years ago, and he made up this study. He's like, I just don't understand. So even though we kind of do this whole fake news, this idea of living perhaps in a rather narcissistic society, you have to own your own truth. So a lot of this book for me was about raising kids that knew their truth, regardless of if someone was pointing at a wall and saying that wall is blue. If you know the wall is pink, you got to be like, actually,
yeah,
pink.
Yeah. And that requires self-efficacy, and it requires critical thinking skills. And those things they're not just given down from the heavens. They have to be developed and fostered.
Yeah,
to be cultivated.
That requires failure. It requires trying again, resilience. It requires creativity. It requires conflict resolution skills, which I don't know about you, but I was certainly never taught, and I'm still kind of bad at, actually.
No, I know. And also, you talk about these 3 core things, and I think we can maybe take some time in a minute to break down what these constructs really are: empathy, creativity, and self-control. But I would love also to take a minute, and I've talked about this before on the show, but I would love your perspective because you're a mother of boys and girls, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that we teach these things to boys and girls so differently, both societally and sometimes just the way that we do. I say we, I don't have kids, but the way that society and individuals parent their children, that empathy looks different for a girl than it does to a boy, when maybe that's not healthy.
Yeah. And it's funny because I don't think it bothered me when I first had kids, but the older I got, I realized I never used gendered language with them at all. I don't even say hey girl or anything like that.
Yeah.
I minimize it so much. And I didn't even realize I was doing it until people would talk to them, in really meaning ways. And I would just be like, oh, I didn't realize I'm not gendering anything until I hear people gendering things. But studies where you can just remind these stereotype threat, right? And so you can put girls in a room and give them a math test. And if you have them check at the top, that they're a girl instead of a boy before they start their math test, they'll actually perform worse, which is crazy to me. My daughter, her math teacher sends her home with math homework every night. She's in 7th grade, and she has the boys do the odds and the girls do the evens, and it drives me mad.
That's so weird.
It is, but there's nothing wrong with it, but it's so wrong to me, you know? So, and I'm explaining to her why that's not okay to like, and she's like, it's fine, Mom.
Cause she's like beyond that. It is pretty funny how like progressive youth are and just like their views on gender and their I mean, depending on the town where you grow up, obviously, but like their views on gender and their views on orientation and things like that are like very different. But you do see it. Like you'll see somebody talking to a little boy and be like, oh, you're so big and strong. And then talking to a little girl, oh, you're so beautiful.
For sure.
And it's like, what does that do over a lifetime?
I mean, I definitely sometimes I feel like I err on the side of like calling my son beautiful and calling him pretty and like, but I do like, even though I'm trying to even it out all the time, I do find that sometimes I do have to work with the boys on things that I don't have to work with the girls. Like consent, we work on all the time. Assumptions and not taking no's are things that I've found I'm working on more with boys than girls. And that just might be my kids. I don't know.
Good. That's amazing. I would venture to guess that most parents don't have, like, a lot of parents are scared to have a basic birds and bees conversation, but how often do you think a consent conversation is had with kids, especially like prepubescent, like as they're growing up? The conversations about consent.
Yeah. I still have one birds and bees conversation to have left.
Yeah.
I've done 3 out of the 4. You know, I'm tired.
Yeah. But the thing is, doesn't it become easier if a kid is raised to understand what no means, to understand respect, to understand boundaries, to understand love and empathy? So in a non-sexual context, because then as it becomes a romantic or sexual context, it translates so readily.
Yeah, we actually start so early that by the time that I have had the consent talk with my oldest, where he actually told it to me. So,
I love that.
So like we start, you know, when they're 2 and they get sprayed in the face with somebody with a water gun. And I'm like, are you enjoying that? And I'm like, you can't spray him in the face unless he says, please spray me in the face. Like not just listening for a no, but like we start really, really young listening for a yes. Like this whole idea, you know, yes means yes and anything else is a no. Like you can teach that with macaroni and cheese and sharing. Like it's so early. And I wish that our schools did a better job of doing that in preschool and kindergarten.
I have to ask, though, because, I mean, you live in a relatively conservative part of the country. I hear a little bit of an accent. I'm not sure where you grew up. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Okay, yeah. So I hear a little bit of a Southern accent. I'm with you. I was born and raised in Texas. And I have to ask, like, do you get flack for the conversations that you have, for the books, you know, or the book that you wrote? Like, do you get flack from people saying like, oh, come on, you're being too like sensitive or too soft, or like you're raising your kids to be wimps? Like, is this something, unfortunately, that you've run up against?
Well, if they met 1 or 2 of them, I don't I really have to especially my oldest right now, he's a run for my money there. But I would say no. And the reason that I haven't hit that is because everything in the book is completely evidence-based.
Yeah.
So I made a real point of not saying anything that I couldn't back up with a scientific study that was peer-reviewed. And so the way that someone chooses to use that, you know, I'm not running around talking about empathy in my house and love and, you know, love and light all the time at all. You know, I'm really a very practical minded parent. I mean, I've been trained so well in the sciences at this point. That's kind of being a skeptic and being a problem solver. Those are my 2 probably greatest parent just attributes. So I actually work hard on these skills myself. These are things that I think parents really actively need to work on too. I'm not the most highly empathetic person in the world. You know, I gotta work on that, and I gotta be like, you know what? I need a minute right now. And it was 2 days ago, my second daughter was like, Mom, you need a minute. And she was right. And I took it and I came back 2 or 3 months later and it was much better.
And it's interesting. I have to ask, like, how much of parenting, I'm always so fascinated by parenting because I'm 35 years old. But I also live in Los Angeles. So it's a little bit more of a progressive area. I have a lot of friends who have, PhDs. So a lot of my friends who are starting families are just recently starting families in their 30s. Mm-hmm. And they, I'm starting to be surrounded by friends with kids. And it's fascinating to me because it's something that's like pseudo alien to me, for sure. But is also really interesting. And I'm like obsessed with my friends' kids. I love them so much. And I'm kind of wondering from this parental neuroscientific perspective, I don't expect you to put a specific number on it, but how much do you think parenting and instilling these kinds of goals, these kinds of traits in your children comes from actively working on that? And how much of it do you think comes from passively being yourself and needing to just actively work on being yourself? Does that make sense at all, that question?
You mean yourself in terms of like parenting or letting the kids be themselves?
I mean more like you being yourself, like empathy, creativity, and self-control. Like how much of kind of fostering that in your children is actively trying to teach those things to your children? And how much is it like turning your vision inward and being true to yourself in terms of empathy, creativity, and self-control, knowing that they are just sponges and they will pick it up from you if those are the vibes you're putting off?
That's such an interesting question. And I think the answer is, I would say it's equally both. Because you can choose whatever you want for your kids and you can try as hard as you want to get there. But if you're not living it, it's only going to sink in so far. Yeah. Because they are smart. And there comes a time when they look at you and you can tell that they understand like what you're trying to do as a parent. And if they see that you're doing it in an external way where you haven't claimed those things for yourself, it's going to be really hard to get them to live in that way. So part of this whole process was realizing that like in terms of brain development, they say, about 35 is when the last stages of myelination or like making your neurons faster is over. And so this is technically when brain development stops. But if you think about brain development as any kind of change in neuronal architecture, so any kind of connection that changes, then our brain development is never done. And it continues until the day that we die because we constantly are learning new things. And the learning of those things changes the way that our neurons look and the way that they function. And so for me, just embracing that I need to learn some of these things and that kind of everybody comes to the table with different things that they're good at and that they're not. But if you hold these three things as important, one person may have to work on 1.5 of them and got the other one down and has always kind of been that and embodied that. And another one of my kids may have the exact opposite, right? But it's been really nice because what it's done is allow me to parent 4 really, really different individuals in a very kind of consistent way. Mm-hmm. And I think that they own it enough that at this point, I can kind of look at them and be like, what would you do if you were me right now? How would you parent this situation for yourself? And they pretty much say what I think I would do. I mean, they pretty much get it at this point. And that's the point is like, you want them to be independent. My son in just a couple years is going to be an adult, which like is crazy to think about. And he will be doing this. Like what you're doing as a parent, you're hoping that they're going to basically parent themselves as soon as they, hit 18. And, if you're, an academic and teaching as well, you will see too that there are some 18-year-olds, that are freshmen that are so crazy unprepared.
Oh yeah.
To make these decisions because they've not done it before. And that's really hard. It makes that freshman year for them so much harder than it needs to be.
Oh, absolutely. That's kind of one of the devastating things to see. I was lucky enough to teach at the university level for quite a few years. And it was always amazing to me how much my classes of college freshmen were like not that different from high school freshmen.
No.
But every so often then you see these really mature kids who, some of that is probably environmental, some of it is genetic, all these things. This nature nurture is like a big swirling, complicated interplay of life experience and biology. But the truth is, you can see a big difference between, one 23-year-old and another 23-year-old. And oftentimes you can point to the things that led them to those places.
Well, and would you say that the college freshmen that you're thinking about that are more like high school freshmen, what is the differentiating factor between them and people who are in the class that are doing really well? Or like, I guess more I'm thinking like the ones that stand out as doing well, what kind of characteristics do they have?
Yeah, it's funny because I think that there's this like bimodal thing, right? Like you will have the kids that do really well because they are like mature and because they understand how to prioritize things and because they're motivated, because they have like a good growth mindset. And then you'll sometimes see these kids who do really well but haven't yet developed some of those skills. And so you just see them like careening towards burnout.
So they're the pleasers.
And and you're like quite worried about these kids who have kind of never failed, that you're like, okay, so far so good. Let's see what happens when you take this one weed out class and you like make a C and your life is over.
Yeah. Well, and this idea about failure, it's so important. And as parents, it's so hard to teach failure. So hard. I have struggled with this so much because like what I've started doing is just like letting my children watch me fail.
Yeah, that's good, which probably cannot be easy.
It's terrible. I Mother's Day, so, was yesterday for us. And I hand drew this picture for my mother and it was turning out so terribly. And I was really embarrassed about it. It's like this woman in a hat and she's holding an umbrella over a little dancing girl. And the kids kept walking past me as I was drawing it and they were like kind of laughing. And I filmed it and I finished it and then I watercolored it and it is ugly. And I gave it to my mom yesterday and, it's not perfect. And I like being perfect so much. Like, who doesn't? But I felt like it was important that they see, you know what? I'm not great at everything. Like, I gave my mom that watercolor anyway.
I love that, though. I think that's so important. And I mean, there is that kind of time in child development where they need to feel like their parents, during really early development, where they need to feel like their parents can take care of them no matter what, that they're completely and fundamentally safe and they're completely and fundamentally, cared for. It's important for healthy attachment. But then there's that point, like you're talking about, where kids need to see that their parents are not perfect. Because in seeing that their parents aren't perfect, they start to understand that the world is a little bit messy. And you can teach them that in a safe place. Then all of a sudden, they're not going to be like knocked on their ass by the world being not perfect.
Yeah. Well, and there's things that you would strive for being perfect at. And there's things that, it doesn't really matter. And for that, they're watching me keep working towards a present for my mom because that's important. Right. But like the content of it, not as important. Like, so part of that exercise in its awkwardness for me was showing them these things are important. These things are not important. It really is about the effort and about the gift and about the intent. And you know what? You watch me go be good at something else, right? I don't have to be perfect at everything. I'm proficiency is okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And so interesting that like these kinds of insights, I think, aren't always shared. Obviously, that's why you wrote the book. That's why you kind of needed or were compelled to write the book. So I'm wondering, maybe we can take a few minutes to like look at the trio, the three things that you specifically focus on, and they're mentioned there in the subtitle of your book: empathy, creativity, and self-control.
Yeah.
So empathy is something that speaks to me, like, deeply. It's something I think we are lacking in our society. It's something that I think is very gendered and taught very differently to boys and girls, which personally I think is the source of like a lot of societal ills. To me, empathy is like fundamental to almost everything else. Was it easy for you to come to that as your first of the three, or did that one come to you? Like, how did you land on empathy?
I find that they're so interrelated. the three things, that it's really hard for me to tease them apart. So I was thinking about long term, how can you help your child be someone that you kind of want to take to lunch with when they're 30? That
I
they're
love that.
functional, they're interesting, they lead interesting lives, they're good people. They, you want to be there. They're not weighing on you. They're giving. And I think that for the empathy bit of it, I kind of came out a little backwards, because I would think about a situation that I was wanting my son or my daughter to do well at, either long-term or short-term, in kindergarten, and then look at the skills underneath that. And I did a lot of work looking at what were the markers of highly successful people in the psychology literature. And so when I realized that these two things kind of went together, that if they had empathy, that this kindergarten situation would go better. If they had empathy, I think this like hypothetical situation for being a boss in the future would go better. And then it is popping up in the literature as one of the things that indicates that a successful person has more of it, that like, especially for empathy, you're more likely to stay married and be in healthy relationships. You're more likely to be happy. These things were, those are all things that we want for our kids. So that's how I arrived at that empathy one. And then the creativity and the self-control, those kind of all go together as this triad that it's a foundation for good self-regulation, like being able to work consistently towards a goal, even if you hit roadblocks, in a way that doesn't hurt other people. This is self-regulation. Yeah. And those three things consistently were popping up in the literature when I looked as indicators of success.
I do have to say, though, I am actively working right now on a research project with one of my professors on creativity. And it is a nightmare, because creativity as a construct is like so hard to define. Yeah. It's so hard to know what you're actually looking at or what you're actually talking about when you talk about creativity. Like there are some basic kind of metrics or measures for it. Like we talk about premature closure, we talk about cognitive flexibility, all these different things. But creativity as a construct is a tough one for me, because although it's one of those things that we know underlies all these great positive outcomes, it's hard to really put our finger on what it means to be creative, isn't it?
It is. And it's funny, these three things are all that way. They're all really hard to pin down. So like creativity has kind of two I guess boot camps are two versions of it. So you've got kind of the in the box and the out of the box, the convergent and the divergent, and they are really different. Like,
okay, so let's talk about what those two things are, because I think a lot of people may not have heard those terms before.
Sure. So like divergent creativity is what we think of as a kind of creative thinkers outside the box. We come up with new solutions to problems. We kind of, if you're drawing, you can have like a squiggle and you have to make it into something. And it's just kind of what you create, what you make, like an upside down triangle, you might make it into a hat or a shark or something like that.
It's sort of turning convention on its ear and thinking, like you said, outside of the box. That's divergent.
Yeah. And then convergent would be kind of the opposite of that, which is you have all these ideas and you need to come up with the right answer to solve a problem. So one of the typical convergent tests would be they give like 3 words and they all would be linked by one word in the front. So it might be like dust and rock and something else. And you would need to come up with the word star. So like rock star, stardust, these kinds of things. And so you have to kind of go out into the world in your head and draw on past experience and make connections to try to come up with the one right problem, which is typically how we test more in our schools.
Yeah. And also it does require like, I don't want to say it has more practical implications, because of course both convergent and divergent creativity have practical implications. But there is this idea of sort of constraint, which is important. I mean, obviously, both of these things are important, but it's important for problem solving, because I do sometimes see these creativity tests, and of course, they're different for different age groups.
Mm-hmm.
So if you give a kid a box and you're like, what can it be? And the kid's like, it's a rocket ship. You're like, oh, that's really good. I mean, if you give like a 30-year-old a box and you're like, what can you do with this? And he's like, it's a rocket ship. You're like, no, it's not. Like, you can't, like, good luck with that. Yeah. But there is, something to be said about the fact that that kind of convergent problem solving actually might have more practical outcomes, but it is sometimes like you're wearing blinders because you have developed all of these constraints over the years that make it so that it is hard to sometimes see solutions even when they're right in front of your face because they don't seem reasonable.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's both are important, right? And so this is why you want to allow for all this creative thought to foster the divergent with our school systems do a really poor job of that. But then the convergent's also super important because if you can't solve a problem in a practical way that kind of improves life, then American society in particular kind of discounts that as a valid form of creativity.
Yeah, you're right.
That is where kind of the self-control and this awareness of where the limits are becomes really important too when you're thinking about the usefulness of creative thought.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Gosh, there's so much to unpack here. And that's just empathy and creativity. I guess we did talk a little bit about self-control and about what that means. That's one of the ones that I feel like is, I mean, they're all very culture bound, but I especially feel like self-control is very culture bound because in Western society, we really push it almost to a place of like extreme independence, personal reliability, like being able to sort of make decisions for yourself and know when to say yes and know when to say no and to do it in sort of a vacuum. Whereas in more Eastern societies, there is more of a communal conversation around the self in general. Even the self is defined very differently.
Yeah. And like that's getting very into empathy territory and just like ideas about perspectives of others versus our own perspectives. But I think in the book, the way I approached self-control was that self-control is really hard to define as well and hard to test. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that's really problematic about the self-control literature is you have to make sure that you're not just testing obedience.
Yeah, like with the marshmallow. So we've talked about Walter Michel's marshmallow test before on this show, which is the test where it's like your kid is sitting alone with a marshmallow. If you don't eat it now and I come back later, you can have 2 marshmallows, but you got to wait. And then like the tester like leaves the room. And so we used to think, oh, the kids who waited to eat it just had better self-control and they had all these better outcomes and blah, blah, blah. But then we found out we were also testing for things like food insecurity. And we're testing for all these multicultural issues that weren't really the construct we were trying to look at. But the test has evolved with time. But you're right. Like sometimes we're tapping into something that's not actually self-control. Like obedience is something very different from self-control.
It is. And it's also, you have to get into the motivating factor of why they would or would not, right, eat the marshmallow. And then you have these kids that are, like we were talking about earlier, these pleasers who would never in a million years defy authority. Yeah. It has nothing to do with self-control, right? It has to do with this obedience. But I think that as parents, we really I don't really want to raise my kids to have great self-control. I don't want them to, like, if they feel like something's off about a situation and there's somebody saying, don't eat that marshmallow, if they really in their gut feel like that marshmallow should be eaten, then I feel like they should eat the marshmallow. That what's more important to me is if they eat the marshmallow and then the kid next to them doesn't get one, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, I love that. That's such an interesting experiment. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's true because self-control is so hard to define. Like sometimes it ends up becoming bastardized into this conversation, especially with boys, where like self-control means don't feel or don't show that you feel. And that's really unhealthy.
Right. And so like especially if you're a kid who has impulse control problems and you keep getting no, like I remember there was one day when my son was like 8 where I was like, oh my gosh, I think I've said no like 30,000 times. So tired of saying his name or saying no. And this idea of self-regulation instead, that's a yes, and self-control is a no. So every time that I got to a place where it was a no, I'd put it back on him and I'd be like, this is a no, but show me a yes. Like if you're dying to have this particular thing happen, or your sister has this book and you can't grab it back or whatever it is, figure out a way that you can make this situation a yes so you can get what you want. So it becomes like this goal-directed behavior instead of having to just tamp down your impulse. Do whatever it is. It's redirect.
Yeah. Oh, that's so important. And negotiation and like you said, empathy, like reflection of other people's needs versus your own needs. Because you're right. I can't imagine that being a parent, even for 2 seconds, is ever easy. And there are days when your kids are horrible and all you can do is say no. But also, it's true, like, what does that do when a kid just hears no and doesn't understand why? Like, one of the things that really frustrates me, and one of the reasons why I think it would be hard for me to parent, is that the idea of just being like, no, but why? Because I said so.
Oh gosh, I've been there. Well,
and that's the thing, you have to. Of course you have to. And I would never blame anybody for doing it.
I mean,
but at the same time,
it off. But like,
yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure.
But this idea of like, if there's a no, you want them to still have this goal-directed behavior. They're trying to get something for themselves. They have a need, they have a want. Mm-hmm. And it's your job as a parent to show them how to get those goals met, whether they're your goals or not, to just do it in a way that doesn't hurt anyone and that doesn't like cause extreme inconvenience to anyone. Like,
yeah. And that doesn't hurt themselves, right? Because they don't really have a lot of foresight, children.
No, not at all. Not at all. But when you do this again and again, and you start when they're little, it's amazing how quickly they can do that. Because these things take a lot of creativity, which is why just working on creativity in general helps bolster these problem-solving skills, so that they can do these things in the classroom. You know, classroom management really doesn't have the time and energy to do this for each kid, but you can do it with your kid at home if he's constantly getting in trouble, you know, for talking out of turn or for doing whatever is an inconvenience to the teacher. You know, with 25 other kids in there, she's not going to be able to make an alternate route to success for him, but you can do it at home.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm so thrilled that we're having this conversation. It's so funny. I just literally found out last night that one of my friends is pregnant. Yay! And she was saying, like, I haven't read any of the books. And she's pretty far along now. She's like, I just can't. There's just so much garbage out there. It's like, I don't even know where to start. And so I'm like so thrilled to be able to share this with her, because I think it's going to really speak to her at a fundamental level. So many parents, I think, are just so afraid of not screwing up.
I mean, we all are.
It must be so much pressure. How do you cope with that? Like, what are some of the kind of informed things that you've learned through writing this book, through being a parent yourself, and through being a neuroscientist, that help you maintain perspective when, gosh, so much is on your shoulders, or at least it must feel like that?
Yeah, I feel like the idea that we have to be on all the time is really exhausting. And I used to feel that way. And I think after writing this book, I realized that I don't have to do it all the time. Like, it's enough to have a couple well-placed things every day that a kid either hears someone else do, sees you do yourself, or you work with them. Whether it's like we're watching a movie and there is a conflict scene in it, I'm like, oh my gosh, what would you do there? Like, I have no idea what I would do there. I'm so scared for him. Like, so small like that. Or like somebody who's really crappy in the line at McDonald's, where you're like, you know, what do you think happened to her at work today? Or, you know, where do you think she's going from here that she's so upset, or something like that? And that is enough. And like, I used to be, when my son was like 9 months old, I had a commute of 20 minutes to work. He's in his little rear facing car seat. And I was literally printing out pieces of paper with alphabet letters on them and posting them on the back of his car seat so that he would look at them. He was 9 months old. Yeah. And I'm doing this because I'm so worried that those 20 minutes are going to be wasted, like educational moments. And that's insane to think that the pressure is so great that we feel like we have to be on and doing that all the time for like a child who can't even talk.
Yeah, I mean, you see it all the time. It's become a trope in like television and film where people are like, spending exorbitant amounts of money and vying for like these competitive daycare situations that are like top tier daycares because they're so afraid that if the kid, when it's like 6 months old, isn't learning French, it's never going to amount to anything as an adult.
Well, and that was one thing that was nice about the book is it honestly relaxed me a lot because some of the things are going to develop with just base amounts of stimulation. Most of our sensory systems, these things don't need you in their face all the time. They don't need like XR saucers with techno lights and these things. They're like way emotional overstimulation. But because of the interplay between like marketing and parenting and the money that's there, parents, it's hard to know what the best information is.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that it comes down to pseudoscience and charlatanism and some of the things that we look out for kind of in the skeptical movement. Really, a lot of it comes down to people preying on your insecurities. Like, oh, I can build a market around this because you are afraid that if you don't buy this new gizmo or download this new app or do, like you said, like all the right things right now, that your kid is like not going to make it or they're not going to develop. And so it's so great to be able to look at the peer-reviewed literature and be able to show sometimes, unfortunately, we don't publish negative results as often as we should, but to be able to show, nope, no difference between doing it this really crazy hard way and just like being.
I know. Well,
Same outcomes.
I would be so much more published.
I know, right?
And then I could be like, look, I'm a failure. See, I published this negative data. Everyone see. And also don't replicate my results because it was fruitless. Like,
yeah, because you're going to waste some time. Because think about, how much time and money is wasted from people being like,
animals too, for animals.
You're so right. So many.
It's unethical, honestly, to not publish those results.
Yeah. And then people do because they're like, well, it's the literature is really sparse in this area. And it's like, yeah, because they couldn't get their
because it doesn't work. Yeah, but I do feel like most people, maybe this is naive of me, but I feel like most people that are selling things to parents like that honestly believe that they have a product that is going to make things better and that the parents are happy to receive it, because I do feel like we all want our kids to succeed and to do better. This idea of like baby Mozart, like that listening to Mozart makes like fetuses smarter. I mean, so this is like taking it way extreme, but certainly there was a governor who sent every baby home from the hospital with a Mozart CD, 10
oh my gosh.
years ago.
Do you know what I saw recently? It was this like horrible device that women are supposed to like wear inside of themselves, like basically like a pregnancy tampon that like plays music to their womb. Yeah, it was horrible.
Oh, gosh.
And it's like, that is not evidence-based.
Well, but that also shows you how desperate parents are for their kids to do well and to get a good start and to be good parents. Like, who would literally do that for the good of a couple of IQ points? It's crazy.
But of course, like once you are fundamentally responsible for another life, that kind of pressure, can make you a little bit crazy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It becomes bad, I think, when people start to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I agree.
And so it is really nice to be empowered with information and to be able to, still make these emotional decisions that we're all always going to make and that I think are good to make because it shows how much you really care about your family and your child and yourself, but also to be able to make sort of more cognitive intellectual decisions, or at least to bleed those things in together. And I think books like yours are just so important. It's not just an exercise in, here's some kind of interesting stuff that you came across as you were doing some research, but like this is really important for so many people who just don't have access to the literature because it's inscrutable.
Yeah. Well, and my hope is that it seems kind of counterintuitive because the last thing that a parent would like to do is learn about neuroscience as they're raising a kid, because it's hard. it's hard to make the time for that. But I do feel like understanding that the way that the pathways are formed to begin with and where these critical periods are, so that you don't feel like for the first 5 years, you can't leave your baby with anybody who's not you or your spouse.
Or you can't leave the house with them.
Right. Or like me, that you have to put up these research that they can only see black and white when they're little and put up these things in their cribs. It should allow us to relax a little bit because we know the truth. And I think the reason that we're on edge as parents all the time is because we don't know which the most true truths are. We're constantly wondering.
And then the negative outcome, kind of the unintended consequence of that, is that the amount of stress and anxiety that we're carrying around is actually negatively affecting our families because they're feeling it from you. They're so attuned to you. And if you're so afraid of screwing up, that it actually causes you to be high strung and maybe inattentive and not present, it's actually doing the exact opposite of what you want it to be doing.
I think what I see more than at cost to the family is it's at cost to the women.
Yeah.
Because there's not room for self anymore if you're constantly giving everything to someone else.
Yeah. And it's probably, I would not be surprised if there was some good literature out there that showed that mothers who really focus on self-care, who meditate, who are introspective, are actually have positive parenting outcomes. I mean, it's definitely the case in the therapeutic environment. You definitely see positive links between therapists who actually are concerned about their own well-being, who go to therapy themselves, who take the time to be able to process some of the difficult things that they deal with their patients. They are better therapists for it. So not only are they getting a positive benefit for their own lives, they're calmer, they're more peaceful, they're more relaxed, but they also can then offer a better therapeutic outcome for their patients because they're prepared.
Yeah. I'm sure you would find that, because one of the things that surprised me the most is this idea of just self-check-in and meditation and reflection for kids and how that helps with empathy and creativity and self-regulation. And then parents also need to do that, in parenting moments that are hard, but also just bigger picture, kind of, is this going the way that I want it to go? Am I still here? Am I present? Is there room for me on this journey? Because parenting is not just about the journey of the child, it's about the journey of the parent as well. What you think is important changes.
Absolutely. That's so true. Yeah, I don't think we have that conversation enough in society, do we? Obviously, people become parents because they want to have a legacy, because they want to give something back, because they want to feel more fulfilled, because, all these different reasons. But part of that is for them. And then it's the minute they have the kid, we don't really care about the parents anymore. We're only concerned about how the kid is benefiting.
Yeah. And I do feel just from a psychological point of view, a lot of the issues that we're going to have with our child in terms of their upbringing and the type of parent that we are certainly taps into our own wounds and our own stuff that we have that's unresolved from our parents.
Oh, yeah.
And I think sometimes we'll, boomerang and we'll be the exact opposite. Right. But if you parent, according to neuroscientific principles, you're less likely to fall into those kind of traps that sometimes are not very obvious to us as we're living them.
Okay. So I would love to know, before we end here, because I've been talking to you for too long, but I'm still fascinated. So let me know if it's okay. But I would love to know, maybe quickly before my final questions, if there are any kind of takeaways from the book, without spoiling, if there are takeaways from your understanding of neuroscience and from a lot of the literature, the review that you did, that if parents only knew this, or maybe things that most parents don't know because they haven't been exposed to the neuroscience, that can be really helpful and comforting to them as they're kind of entering on this journey.
Yeah, I think that the number one thing that parents don't know that they should know is that these three things in the title, so creativity, empathy, and self-control are teachable skills. And I think even as a neuroscientist, when I first approached this, I didn't know that there is actually literature that says these things are not innate, these things are not talents, these are not really character traits, but instead they are learned things. We do not come out, of the womb either being any of these things. These are all learned, and we are certainly predisposed to kind of have more or less of these. But what we practice on a daily basis is going to allow us get better at this. And so I didn't realize that, actually. And the numbers that I was finding about, and there's lots of studies, you have to take kind of an average, but this nature nurture idea, we've been raised my generation was raised to think of this as a battle, a nature versus nurture. Who will win? And is it the child in the woods who comes out that never had a family? Or is it, give me a man that, I can mold him into anything. Just give me the opportunity. Like, which one is it? And what's crazy about all of it is that it's actually through epigenetics and just gene regulation, they're completely interconnected. So what you do as a parent can actually turn genes on and off in your child. And I don't think that parents necessarily understand how that process works in terms of that you're literally kind of precise controllers of the genes that could turn on and off in your children if you're placing these kind of sculpted practice sessions for things that you think are important to their overall development in their paths, such that they have to kind of go through them and have experience. Like, this is just experiential learning that you're directing as a parent, not just letting whatever they deal with at school do it, but kind of have a more hands-on approach to making sure they get these skills while they're still with you.
Absolutely. Well, gosh, okay. I've taken so much of your time so far, Erin, but I do want to, if you're okay with it, I always close every episode by asking my guests the same two questions. And I'd be sad if we didn't get to those two questions with you as well, especially with your unique perspective. So they're kind of big picture. You ready for them?
I'm ready.
Okay. So I want you to think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you. So obviously that could be your work. It could be kind of global issues. It could be, your kids, your family, whatever is sort of on your mind right now. Number one, I want you to tell me, what is the thing that really does keep you up the most at night, that you're most concerned about, maybe even a little kind of pessimistic about? But then on the flip side of that, what are you sort of genuinely hopeful and optimistic for?
I think that what I'm worried about is the structure of traditional schooling in the U.S. right now focuses mostly on what we want our kids to know as adults. And what we think they'll be kind of it's more factory-based still, even though we have all this literature that says it should be play-based, it should have emotional content, some kind of training in there. All these things were kind of in there when I went to kindergarten, so be it, 35 years ago. But at this point, these things have been squeezed out. I see them kind of coming back. And so maybe this is part of the hope for the future, is I do see these ideas of like responsive classroom and the roots of empathy programs that are kind of making their way into preschools, into early education. But I feel like, especially in the elementary schools, we've got this really kind of capped, unique opportunity to get these things in before middle school, where all of a sudden it's like we wake up and we're like, oh, we should be teaching communication skills, and we should be teaching how not to be a mean girl and how to report bullies. And, but these things need to happen way earlier.
Yeah, it's like they take us by surprise that they develop. And it's like, this has been happening throughout forever. Like, we know that there's going to be tribalism, and we know there's going to be bullying. I mean, let's not cope with it when it comes. Let's work on preventive measures.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, for the people who are worried about this, to give them tools to use. This is what you say. This is what you do. And this isn't like, go get a teacher, because this happens all the time. Like, they go run for the teacher, and the problem just kind of persists. And this idea of like creativity, because the way that things are being taught in the classrooms right now, it's really hard to teach in a way that fosters creativity, because it's hard to grade. It's hard to let people have that much flexibility within a classroom. It's just classroom management can't do it. And so this idea of actually using creativity and decision-making processes in the way that we teach our curricula is a better way perhaps to do that, so that you have it built into the learning. Because there's also been studies that say that tapping into the creative process is inherently rewarding, and it can help solidify memories. And so you can actually learn better if you're in control of your own learning and can kind of direct it yourself. So my hope is that we can kind of move towards these things that studies are showing, hey, experiential learning works better than, sitting in a classroom, and project-based is great, and student-driven is great, and actually figure out a way to do it where it's not so exhausting for the teachers that they feel like they can't do it.
Yeah. And then the interesting thing is that, of course, this has really fundamental downstream effects. And we can be talking some of the biggest global difficulties, crises, problems that need to be solved in the world are going to be solved by these minds. Yeah. And being able to, I keep saying using the word cultivate, but I think that's really what we're talking about, being able to help cultivate some of these abilities, is so fundamentally important for society as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that would be my hope, or my dream would be that we have just kind of a priority shift in terms of what we value as parents, in terms of what we have our kids grow up and value in society. This idea of respect and self-respect at the same time, to just kind of be more in touch with who we are. It sounds really kind of love and light. But at the same time, I feel like, more than anything, more than even successful kids, I think parents want to raise happy kids.
Yeah, I agree. Well, gosh, Erin, this was so much fun. I learned an awful lot, especially as a non-parent. And I can only imagine that the people listening did as well. So guys, hopefully this has inspired you to pick up Erin's book, Second Nature: How Parents Can Use Neuroscience to Help Kids Develop Empathy, Creativity, and Self-Control. Erin, where can people learn more about your work? Are you active on social media? Are there places that they can go to read some of the things that you've written outside of the book?
Oh, sure. So I am on Instagram at Erin Clabough, PhD. Also, there's an author Facebook page, the Erin Clabough. And I have a website, Erin Clabough, PhD. Those are probably the best ways. And then I have a Psychology Today blog as well. So those are probably the best ways to find me.
Very cool. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining me. It was just fascinating and so much fun as well.
Thanks, Cara. It was awesome to talk to you.
Yeah. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.